Someone recently messaged me on Facebook and asked me whether or not Christians should keep the seventh-day Sabbath, Saturday, holy. I said, of course, it's the fourth commandment. Their response was, well, Jesus broke it, so we don't have to keep it anymore. I've actually heard this excuse numerous times in the past, but is this really true? Did Jesus break one of God's commandments and show us by His example that we don't have to keep the Sabbath anymore? In John chapter 15 verse 10, Jesus said, "If ye keep my commandments, ye shall abide in my love, even as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in His love." Jesus kept His Father's commandments, so He didn't break the Sabbath, since the Sabbath is one of God's 10 commandments. Not to mention, if Jesus did break the Sabbath, that means that He sinned, since disobeying God is sinning. And if He sinned, He wouldn't be able to save us. It is by virtue of His sinless sacrifice that we are saved. When we accept the sacrifice of Jesus for our sins, He substitutes His righteousness for our sinfulness. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 21 puts it this way, "For He hath made Him to be sin for us, who knew no sin, that we might be made the righteousness of God in Him." One of the reasons why some people think Jesus broke the Sabbath is because that's what the Pharisees accused Him of doing, especially when it came to Jesus performing acts of healing. For example, in speaking about when Jesus healed a blind man, John chapter 9 verses 14 through 16 states, "And it was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes." Then again, the Pharisees also asked him, the blind man, how he had received his sight. He said unto them, "He, Jesus, put clay upon mine eyes, and I washed, and do see." Therefore said some of the Pharisees, "This man is not of God, because he keepeth not the Sabbath day." Others said, "How can a man that is a sinner do such miracles?" And there was a division among them. However, the Bible never actually forbids acts of healing on the Sabbath day. As a matter of fact, this is something Jesus encouraged. For instance, after Jesus healed a paralytic woman, Luke chapter 13 verses 14 through 17 says, "And the ruler of the synagogue answered with indignation, because that Jesus had healed on the Sabbath day, and said unto the people, There are 6 days in which men ought to work. In them therefore come and be healed, and not on the Sabbath day." The Lord then answered him and said, "Thou hypocrite, doth not each one of you on the Sabbath loose his ox or his ass from the stall, and lead him away to watering? And ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan hath bound, lo, these 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath day?" And when he had said these things, all his adversaries were ashamed, and all the people rejoiced for all the glorious things that were done by him. Here, Jesus showed that acts of healing and mercy are acceptable on the Sabbath day, and the wisdom of his answer put the religious leaders to shame. Notice also what Jesus didn't say here. Jesus didn't say that the Sabbath isn't important, or that it's done away with, or that he didn't keep the Sabbath anymore. Instead, he helped people gain a better understanding of what true Sabbath keeping is all about. In doing so, he actually fulfilled a messianic prophecy from Isaiah chapter 42 verse 21, which states, "The Lord is well pleased for his righteousness' sake. He will magnify the law and make it honorable." There were other times that the Pharisees accused Jesus or his disciples of breaking the Sabbath as well. In Matthew chapter 12, Jesus' disciples were walking through a cornfield on the Sabbath and began to pluck and eat corn. Verse 2 says, "But when the Pharisees saw it, they said unto him, Behold, thy disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath day." If you read the context of the passage, Jesus goes on to justify their action by citing exceptions to a couple of religious rules. Verses 3 through 4 state, "But he said unto them, Have ye not read what David did when he was an hungered, and they that were with him? How he entered into the house of God, and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them which were with him, but only for the priests." Only the priests were allowed to eat the showbread. However, when David and his band of men were on the run from King Saul, the priest gave them some showbread to eat, because there was no other bread around. That was an exception to the rule so that David could be strengthened and nourished to preserve his life. It was a matter of necessity for David and an act of mercy on the priest's part, so it was justified. Kind of like the disciples. They were hungry, and so out of necessity, they picked corn to eat on the Sabbath. By the way, there's nothing wrong with eating on the Sabbath, in case you're wondering. However, the Pharisees may have been upset because they considered what Jesus' disciples did as threshing. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Continuing on, in verse 5 Jesus said, "Or have ye not read in the law, how that on the Sabbath days the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless?" The priests did a lot of work on the Sabbath, which is supposed to be a day of rest and worship. They offered sacrifices, dressed them, and did a lot of other things. They probably performed twice the amount of labor on the Sabbath than any other day. However, they did it in the service of the Lord, and that was an exception to the rule. The disciples were involved in the service of the Lord when they ate corn from the cornfield as well. Walking through a cornfield and picking and eating corn is not something somebody would usually do on the Sabbath, but since Jesus and his disciples were involved in the ministry of God, it was justifiable. As a matter of fact, what Jesus and his disciples were doing was even more important than what the priests were doing in the temple. That's why Jesus said in verse 6 that in this place is one greater than the temple. And Jesus wraps it all up in verses 7 through 8, saying, "But if ye had known what this meaneth, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, ye would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day." I already talked about how mercy fits into all of this, but what did Jesus mean by saying he is Lord of the Sabbath day? He meant that he has the authority to decide what is acceptable and not on the Sabbath, not the Pharisees. You see, the problem with the Pharisees was that they loaded the Sabbath down with numerous man-made restrictions that made it practically impossible to observe and enjoy as intended. They took things to extremes, like the disciples picking and eating corn being considered threshing. As a matter of fact, the Mishnah, which is literature containing Jewish traditions written in the 2nd century AD, includes 39 restrictions of things Jews couldn't do on the Sabbath. These existed during Jesus' day. Some of them are biblical and I agree with them. For example, sowing and plowing. That's farm work. Nobody should be doing that on the Sabbath, obviously, or building and demolishing. I totally agree with that. But there were other restrictions that were kind of extreme, like tying or untying, writing 2 or more letters or erasing 2 or more letters, and transporting an object a distance greater than 4 cubits, which is equivalent to 6 feet. And really, that's why the Pharisees were angry with Jesus, because he had no regard for a lot of these traditions that the Jews invented, which made Sabbath keeping a burden instead of a delight. And why did the Jews invent all of these additional restrictions for keeping the Sabbath? It's because one of the reasons Judah went into Babylonian captivity in the Old Testament is because the Jews were breaking the Sabbath, and the Jews of the New Testament wanted to avoid that from happening again. Jeremiah chapter 17 verses 21 through 23 indicates that the Sabbath was being disregarded by the Jews before they were taken as captives to Babylon. It includes a message God gave through Jeremiah the prophet and its negative reception. It states, "Thus saith the Lord, take heed to yourselves, and bear no burden on the Sabbath day, nor bring it in by the gates of Jerusalem. Neither carry forth a burden out of your houses on the Sabbath day. Neither do ye any work, but hallow ye the Sabbath day, as I commanded your fathers. But they observed not, neither inclined their ear, but made their neck stiff, that they might not hear, nor receive instruction." Verse 27 issued a warning against their persistent Sabbath breaking, stating, "But if you will not hearken unto me to hallow the Sabbath day, and not to bear a burden, even entering in at the gates of Jerusalem on the Sabbath day, then will I kindle a fire in the gates thereof, and it shall devour the palaces of Jerusalem, and it shall not be quenched." And that is exactly what happened when the Babylonians captured the Jews. Jeremiah chapter 39 verses 8 through 9 says, "And the Chaldeans burned the king's house, and the houses of the people with fire, and break down the walls of Jerusalem. Then Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried away captive into Babylon the remnant of the people that remained in the city, and those that fell away, that fell to him, with the rest of the people that remained. Fast forward to Jesus' day, the Jewish religious leaders came up with all kinds of restrictions to guard from this happening again. And when Jesus didn't follow those restrictions, they accused him of breaking the Sabbath and were terrified that others would follow his lead and the Jews would once again be displaced from their land. That's why the chief priests and Pharisees said in John chapter 11 verse 48, "If we let him thus alone, all men will believe on him, and the Romans shall come and take away both our place and nation." Consequently, they decided to kill him. John chapter 5 verse 18 tells us, "Therefore the Jews sought the more to kill him, because he not only had broken the Sabbath, according to their traditions, but said also that God was his Father, making himself equal with God." Jesus didn't break the Sabbath. He exalted the Sabbath and set it free from all of the traditional burdens that had been placed on it by the Jewish religious leaders. By his example, he demonstrated that acts of mercy and healing were acceptable on the Sabbath, and some things that people wouldn't typically do on the Sabbath, like eating corn from a cornfield, could be justified if it takes place during the service of the Lord. The Sabbath is still relevant today. It hasn't been done away with. It hasn't been changed. Jesus never said anything indicating such a thing during his earthly ministry. The question is, after learning about this truth, are you willing to keep the Sabbath in accordance with the Word of God? If you still have some questions about the Sabbath and are not sure, pray about it and check out my video entitled 20 Facts About the Sabbath Every Christian Must Know. I'll leave a card to it on the upper right hand corner of the screen, which you can click on to watch. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like it and share it. Subscribe if you're new, and click on the notifications icon next to the subscribe button so you don't miss any of my future uploads. Also, please pray that my ministry will continue growing and reaching people for Christ. And if you'd like to support my channel and ministry with a donation, links to my PayPal and Patreon accounts are available in the description box. Your donations really help. And to check out some more of my videos by clicking on the screen. I have a lot of good Christian videos which I'm sure you'll enjoy if you liked this one. God bless you.